Okay, so today's lesson 4, part 2. So for our Windows users, we've just gone over the process of connecting to our local server and then setting up a database, which is pretty simple. We just right click and say new database. So I'm going to go through the process now. And I'd still like you, even if you're connected locally, I'd still like you to go through the process of also setting up your database on Azure, because you need that so you can start working on your assignment. And if you're a Mac user, you're also going to use that database for our game store. So the first thing we need to do is go to the Azure Portal. And the link for that, which I'll put in the chat, is portal.azure.com. Same site where we were that we used to download. Many of you downloaded Visual Studio and SQL Server from the Azure Portal. So I'm going to sign in. Ginelle, try the first one. If you have more than one, try the first one. It doesn't really matter. So I'm going to kind of just walk you through the process first, tell you what it is we're going to do, and then we'll do it together. Okay. So the link is here as well. Again, this slide deck is on Blackboard in lesson 4. It's titled the week 4 slides. So everything you're seeing in the PowerPoint, you have access to this on Blackboard. So we're going to go to the portal. We're going to create a new SQL Server resource, and we need to set up both the server and the database, and then we need to set up a username and password. So what I'm going to recommend to keep the credentials simple, when we get to this screen, for the server name, I'm going to suggest we use GC and then your 9-digit student number, because it's unique. Everybody knows their student number, so you shouldn't have an issue remembering it. We'll kind of use similar conventions to what we did when we set up the MySQL databases for you with AWS last semester. Our database name, you're going to have to create a name for your database. So I'm just going to suggest you call it GC and again, your student number. You'll then have to set up a username and password. You can use any username and password you like, but to keep it simple, my suggestion is just use your first name as your username. And for your password, I suggest using the city you were born in and then the year you were born. So something like this. Again, you don't have to use these credential sets, but that way you're not going to have to worry about remembering them if you follow this. You may want to put them in a separate file as well so that you have this connection info and you can refer to it later on. The other thing we're going to do, that's going to create the database. Once we're done, we're going to have to configure the firewall. And the reason is the Azure service is set up that it doesn't allow remote connections into the database. So we're going to open up the firewall to allow our IP addresses to access it. So that's going to be the Azure Portal end, setting the database up, and then we're going to connect to it. If you're on Windows, you'll use Management Studio. If you're on a Mac, you can use Azure Data Studio to connect to it. So I'm going to go to the portal and set up the database. Again, this is the only time in the semester you should have to do this. So if you can get your database set up now, you won't have to do this again. So in the portal, you should be able to click on SQL databases and choose Create. This is right in the Azure Portal homepage. If you don't see SQL databases here, you can just choose Create a Resource, and it will list all kinds, and then we can pick SQL database from here. They both go to the same place, so it doesn't matter how we get there. You can even search for SQL up here in the search bar if you want, and then pick SQL database. So lots of different ways of getting there. So I'm going to click on SQL database. And again, these steps, they're already documented for you. I am recording it, but they're already documented in this PowerPoint slide, which is on Blackboard. Under my subscription, this should default to your Azure for Students. Okay, If you don't have a subscription, then you first need to go and sign up for one. So you can do that. I'll give you the link in a second. You can go here to your Azure for Education, go to the Azure for Education. And if you click on free account or start free, you can click on activate now. And then I think there will be a form asking you to enter your school. It may ask you what program you're in and when you expect to finish your program. And then you'll want to enter your Georgian email, and they will send you a verification link to your student email. So that process may take a couple minutes. So they want to verify that you are a student. So under my subscription should be Azure for Students. Under Resource Group, you probably have an empty drop down here. So I'm going to click on Create a New Resource Group. This just allows us, if we make, let's say, 10 different databases and 10 different web applications, we could make a group for each one. So the database and web application for one client project are grouped together. So I'll create a new one. I'll just call it, I don't know, I'll call it COMP2084. You can give it any name. And then it wants us to put in a database name. So I'm going to suggest here you use GC and your 9-digit student number. And then it wants me to create a new server here, which will pop open a little window on the right where we can enter the server name and set up a username and password to access our database server. So again, for the server name, I would suggest just using GC and your student number. No, mine's already in use because I've already created this. For my username, I'll just enter my first name. And for my password, I will put in my birth city and the year I was born. You can put in any credentials you like, just make sure you don't lose them. So it's a good idea to then put them in a file because we're going to need all these credentials. Hung, you were asking, how do we connect to the database? We're going to need all these credentials in our Visual Studio project. So Visual Studio and our web pages can connect to the database. The location here defaults to East US. Doesn't really matter. You can leave it. I think they have a data center in Canada. If you want, you can pick Canada Central, but the location isn't important. Okay. So GC and your student number, the database name, create a new server, enter GC and your student number as the server name. That's fine. If you already have, Farouk, do you already have an existing server? If you do, you can use it. You don't need to create. Do you have an Azure for Students account? Have you used it before? So the option create new is visible, or is it just visible but disabled? Okay, so what happens when you click it? So just leave the default location. You can't pick any location you want. Okay, so try a different location. try Canada Central. So then I'll click OK. So my server's created. Okay, great. Now under here, I'm not sure if yours says the same. Notice under compute and storage down at the bottom, it shows me Gen 5, 2 cores. So with a cloud hosting service, we can choose what level of hosting service we want. The more powerful the service, the more expensive it is. So I want to choose the cheapest, most basic service because Microsoft gives us $100 in credits. So we want those credits to last as long as possible. So I'm going to click this blue link that says Configure Database. So it defaults, for me anyway, maybe not for you, it defaults to a general purpose database, which is not their smallest. Over here on the left, there's a link that says looking for basic, standard, or premium, which is what I want. So I'm going to click this looking for basic standard link. And then I'm going to pick basic over on the left. This is the smallest. So you'll notice when I pick, it doesn't even give me a cost, which is what I want. And then I'm going to click apply. So it's only 2 gigabytes of storage. We don't need 2 gigabytes. We're going to use like just a tiny, tiny amount. Because the way cloud hosting works, it's not like Justin's GoDaddy account. With traditional shared, yes, basic, standard, and then basic, Stephen. With traditional hosting like on GoDaddy, we pay a flat rate. So we pay a flat rate, but we get the flat amount of resources. With cloud hosting, we actually pay per use. The more resources we use and the more time our service is active, the more we spend. So we want to pick the least expensive options. So again, go to Configure. It defaulted here to general purpose for me. You want to choose looking for basic standard and just pick basic and apply that. Oh, the elastic pool you can leave. No, we don't need the elastic pool. The elastic pool is basically saying if your database gets used by many people at the same time, it will copy the database to multiple servers so it runs faster. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, so just leave that to no. So once we've finished choosing those options, we're just going to click Review and Create. So it shows me, here's my database name and my server. I'm using the basic plan. And I'll just click Create. Now this will take a couple minutes. First, it has to create the server. And then once the server is set up, it has to create the database in the server. So they've accepted. I'm not sure what you mean, Farouk. What do you mean by it's normal? Oh, it says $6 a month. Yeah, so what that means is you're getting their expected use is it will cost $6 a month, but we don't have to pay because with the Azure for Students plan, okay, hold on, Diana, then we need to change that. That will eat up your credits immediately. So Diana, go back in and make sure you're choosing all the lowest options. I may need you to share your screen with me in a minute. In fact, I'm just going to stop my screen share. Diana, why don't you share yours and we can look at the options. So the option I picked, Farouk, if it said $6, that means it'll use $6 of that $100 credit.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yep. So click on Configure Database. Okay. Can you scroll over to the right? Let's go down to the bottom. Yeah. Okay. So that's right. So click Apply. So do you just click Review and Create here? It looks okay. Click View Pricing Details. Okay, click OK. And scroll down again. Click Previous. Something's not right here. At the top, let's go to Basics. We may have to look through here a little. Okay, let's try networking. Let's go through these tabs at the top. Okay, go to Additional Settings. Okay, those look right. Let's go to Review. I don't think it'll be under Tags. Go to Review and Create.
The location is different. Does that matter?
Might.
Yeah, let's try a different location. So go back to basics. Let's try changing the location. That's a good point. So for location, yeah, that's fine. No, it's not here. Close that window. Let's create let's create a new server. Try picking Central Canada. That's what I picked. Canada Central. Yeah, pick that. I think you'll have to change the server name now because you've already created one with that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can try it, but okay, let's click OK. And go back to configure. Yep. Basic. And click basic. Yep. And apply. And review. Let's go to review and create.
Still, I'm with my college account.
I'm
Okay, I can figure
just
out
looking at mine to see if it says anything about that on mine. I'm going to go to the database and see if it shows me anything like that. My pricing is basic. I'm not sure, Diana. We may have to look at it separately.
It's okay.
I don't
Yeah,
see...
I am in Canada. Sorry, somebody asked if I'm in Canada. It's okay. Yeah, you can look at it after.
Okay. Okay, so my database is set up now. So I'm going to try to connect to it now through Management Studio. If you have Azure Data Studio, if you're on a Mac, it should be similar. So open up Azure Data Studio if you're a Mac user, or you can use if you're on Windows. So what I want to do now is I want to connect to my Azure server. So up here in Registered Servers, you should have a folder that says Local Server Groups if you just expand this registered server. I'm going to right-click and choose New Server Registration. Again, this is just a one-time setup. You won't have to do this repeatedly. We're going to set up a connection to our Azure database. If you're a Mac user and you're in Azure Data Studio, this window may look a little different. So you can tell me in the chat what you're seeing. So I can also help you if you're on a Mac. So for the server name, this is where you're going to put in GC and your student number. And the server name is then .database.windows.net. So the same server name, you can even copy this from the Azure portal. I'll show you where to get the server name. So in the Azure portal, once your database is created, if you just mouse over your server name, you can click copy, or you can type it. So in Management Studio, Farouk, you should have this window that says registered servers. And then in here, there's a folder. Okay, then just do this. Click File and Connect Object Explorer. And that will bring up the Connect to Server dialog you see on my screen. So then you paste in your server name here, or you type it. Your authentication has to be SQL Server. You can't use Windows authentication for Azure. So you change authentication from Windows to SQL Server. Now you put in your username and password we just created in the Azure portal. So if you followed my naming, just one sec, convention, Rudia, put in your username and then your password and click remember password. And then I'm going to try to connect from my local Management Studio or my Azure Data Studio. I'm going to try to connect to Azure. So I click connect. And I get this. It says new firewall rule. Your client IP does not have access. You must create a new firewall rule to enable access. Stephen, I would suggest hit test first. And you should get a window similar to this. So it's trying to connect. It recognizes my username and password, but it's saying the Azure database, it doesn't allow remote connections. So we're going to have to fix that. Rudia, go ahead and with your question. So this is expected behavior so far. Okay, yeah, you're in the Azure portal. Justin, I'll come to your question in a minute. Yes, Rudia. You want to select the basic tier, the lowest tier they have. So that's on the list. Rudia, do you want to share your screen for just a second so I can have a look? Okay, it's loading. Okay, there. No, don't check that. Uncheck serverless. Okay, click, there's a blue link below that says change configuration. Okay, click cancel here. Scroll down. Let's click back out of here. This is not the right, oh, there, looking for basic standard premium. Yes, that link there. And now click basic on the left. Yes, there you go. Now click apply. Now click review and create. Yep, and create. So this should use $6. Yeah, $6 a month is the average, but they give us the credit is for $100 US. So we have 3 months left in the course. The database should use $6 a month. Okay. Yeah, Diana, we may have to look at that offline for you. Okay, so before I can connect, I have to fix my firewall because it's not letting me in. So Justin, I'm going to come to your question. How do we fix the firewall to allow a remote connection in? So I'm just going to cancel this. I'm going to go back to my database in the Azure portal. And right here on the main screen in the overview section of my database, on this navigation bar, there's a button right in the middle that says Set Server Firewall. So I'm going to click on that button. It says Set Server Firewall. And I could allow just my current IP address, but the problem is if Rogers changes my IP address, which happens occasionally, or I want to go and work at a friend's house or something, that IP address, if I allow my current IP address in, it may not work tomorrow, or it may not work if I go somewhere else to work, if I go to the college to work. So what I want to do is I want to allow all IP addresses access to the server so long as they have the right credentials. So down here on the firewall settings, I have these three text boxes down here. So I'm going to create a firewall rule that allows all IP addresses in so long as they have the username and password. So in the first text box, I'll just type in a name for my rule. This is just a string. I'll call it all. My start IP will be 0.0.0.0. And my end IP is 255.255.255. So no matter where I am in the world, as long as they have a username and password, I can access my database. And once I'm done, there's a save button here near the top left underneath my little blue shield with the gold lock. Here's the save button. So you can see the values I've typed in these three text boxes. Under rule name, I put all. Start IP is 0.0.0.0. And end IP is 255.255.255.255. So when I'm done, I'm just going to click the Save button. So now my IP address and anybody's IP address is no longer blocked from accessing my database. So then I'm going to come back down to Management Studio, and now I'm going to try Connect again. So I don't have to change my credentials. I've already entered them. But now when I click Connect, my Object Explorer is connected, and here is my database. It's empty. So now in Management Studio, I'm connected to two databases. The first one is my local copy, my local server. And the second one is my Azure server. Yep, sure, Maria, I will show that again. So first we go, yes, Stephen, you can save it. Justin, as I said, you can use the client IP option, but if your IP changes, you won't have access. So by setting a rule allowing all IPs, you'll be able to access the database even if your IP changes. So using the client IP will work for today, but it will lock you out if your IP gets changed, which is something that typically is up to your hosting provider. So Maria, underneath, I can go right back to home. So if your database isn't open, your database should show up here. So here is my SQL database right from the main homepage. So go into your database, and there's this big sub-navigation on the left, but it defaults to the overview. And there's a toolbar here in the middle of my screen near the top. And right in the middle, there's 7 buttons on the toolbar. The 4th button in the middle is Set Server Firewall. So you just click that button here that I'm highlighting on my screen. This opens the firewall settings, and I created a rule called all with the start IP of all zeros and the end IP of all 255. No, we don't use the master database. You use the one for this class. The master database is just used to keep track of the users and permissions. So create the firewall rule and click save. And once you've clicked save, we should then be able to connect in Management Studio. Now, I know there are several people working with Azure Data Studio on a Mac. I don't have that program, so maybe you can give me an indication in the chat if connecting to the server is similar in Azure Data Studio as what I've shown here in Management Studio. If it's not, maybe I can ask someone who has a Mac if they could share their screen so I could help the Mac users get connected. Okay, thanks, Maggie. Okay, so you're here, so you've been able to connect. Liam, it doesn't matter. The data is going to be really small. We're going to have like a few tables with maybe a couple dozen records in it. So the data size is going to be teeny tiny. It's a good question, but we don't need to worry. So Maggie, thank you for sharing that. And if at any point anything we do today in Azure Data Studio looks really different, feel free to let me know in the chat and maybe I can ask you to share. Thank you. That was very helpful. Okay, so I've connected. But Justin, you did create your database. You may have to share your screen with me in a bit so I can see it. Okay, so the database end is set up. You won't have to do this again in Azure. Once you've got the database set up and you're connected, these things, you won't have to walk through this process again, which is good. Okay, so I realized that was a bit involved, but we should be okay. All right, it's 10 to 1 now. So what I want to do is let's take a break here. Hopefully people have got their databases created. We'll come back at 1 o'clock. And then what we want to work on is connecting now our Visual Studio project. Yeah, Maggie, you can use the same database for both. Excuse me, like we did with our PHP class, we had one MySQL database and you used it. We used it in class for the music library. You also used it for our project. You don't need to create a separate database. You can use the same database for both. That'll make it simpler, and it'll also use less resources on the Azure server. So we now have a working web application. We have a working database set up either on Azure or locally. So the next thing we want to do is we want to connect our web project, our Get Me a Game project. We want to connect it up through Visual Studio. Hung, that should be in your project. We'll look at that next. That file is already here. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and when we come back, if you want to read ahead, you can look at you can look at my explanation in the slides about what it is we're going to do and how our ASP.NET project connects to the database. And then we'll do the work together to connect them up. And then we're going to build our models and build the tables in our database. And then we'll try some code generation to build our views and controllers. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. I'll try to come back at 12:55. So I can help people who need help, and we'll resume the lesson at 1 o'clock.